Good morning and welcome to the KDPG Sunday edition. I'm Ken Rice. The late German Chancellor Ludwig Erhard once said, "Compromise is the art of dividing a cake in such a way that everyone believes that he has the biggest piece." This past week, the U.S. Supreme Court's 7-2 ruling about a controversial same-sex wedding cake seemed to leave each side with something to support their viewpoint. We begin this morning with Mola Lenghi on the High Court's decision and those affected.
The Supreme Court said Jack Phillips' religious rights were violated when a Colorado Civil Rights Commission ruled against him because he refused to bake a cake for a same-sex wedding. Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote, "The Civil Rights Commission's treatment of his case has some elements of a clear and impermissible hostility toward the sincere religious beliefs that motivated his objection." Phillips says same-sex marriage violates his Christian beliefs.
Though I serve everyone who comes into my shop, like many other creative professionals, I don't create custom designs for events or messages that conflict with my conscience.
It was Charlie Craig and Dave Mullins who asked Phillips to create their cake. They say they're disappointed with the court's decision, but not defeated.
I feel like we've helped change public opinion, and that's a win for us.
The court's ruling did reaffirm protections for LGBTQ rights and left open the possibility that future cases involving refusal of service could be decided differently.
Justice Kennedy said, on the one hand, here's that argument. On the other hand, here's that argument. I want to respect everybody's dignity. And here the Colorado Commission did not. And so this guy wins.
The ACLU, which represented Craig and Mullins, said the court reversed the Masterpiece Cake Shop decision based on concerns unique to the case, but reaffirmed its long-standing rule that states can prevent the harms of discrimination in the marketplace, including against LGBT people. Mola Lenghi, CBS News, the Supreme Court.
The Supreme Court ruling comes as Pittsburgh's LGBTQ community celebrates Pride Week with a series of events. And this morning we'll look at what the Supreme Court wedding cake ruling means to that community. We'll also examine the state of gay rights in Pittsburgh and some division that's developed among different portions of that population. Our guest, Gary Van Horn, president of the Delta Foundation of Pittsburgh, and the organization's Director of Marketing and Development, Chris Bryan. David Tribman is away this week. John Allison, editorial page editor of the Post-Gazette, joins us. John, always nice to have you here. Welcome to both of you. Pride Week coming to an end as we speak here on Sunday morning. How's it been going?
Everything's been going fantastic. We've had record crowds. Okay weather. Good, not Pittsburgh weather. Typical Pittsburgh June weather, we'll call it.
It's always iffy.
But today we have our final day, which is the march that starts at 12:30, the EQT Equality March at 12:30, which steps off at the Boulevard of the Allies at Grant Street and proceeds down Fifth Avenue. And then we have our last day of our free festival, Pride Fest, which is from 1 to 7.
Everybody's welcome.
Everybody's welcome.
Okay, we'll talk more about Pride Week events in a minute, but let's talk about this cake ruling. First of all, your reaction to 7-2 ruling, and yet it's being described as a narrow decision because of how the justices structured their argument and saying that this is going to apply to this particular case, not necessarily to any other. Gary, what's your reaction?
Well, I think if you're looking at the country right now, there's a temperament. I think since the election of our new president that's been in office for 2 years now, almost 2 years, I guess you could say, I think that we're all really concerned. I think people are saying things that they've never said before. The president says things that presidents have never said before. And I think that at the end of the day, what is the country that we want to live in? And a place where we accept everybody into, as it relates to public accommodation, or a place where we discriminate against this person or that person because of who they love or because of how they look or whatever. And I think from a community standpoint, you know, it was very narrowly focused, but we're really concerned. And I think where our community is going to be out fighting and going in the election box, et cetera, to make sure that we have people in place that treat, at the end of the day, we want to be treated just like everybody else.
So the justice has said that this Colorado Civil Rights Commission was essentially hostile to this baker's First Amendment rights and his religious beliefs. He didn't want to use his creative, artistic talents to create this cake, and the commission said that they ruled against him. Of course, this is what the Supreme Court overturned, but what about that? What about somebody feeling that they have no choice, that they may be asked through their business to do something, create something that violates their personal principles?
I think if that's the case, then you just say, I'm unable to do it, I'm too busy for you today. Or our schedule is booked.
You can't be honest about it.
I think you run into some problems when you become honest, and I think that's what we saw here.
So is there a larger message then to, I mean, the justices work to keep this narrow, but it's saying that there are some cases where you can infringe. This is a case where this baker's rights were infringed upon, and they upheld it. Is that a? Well, I know that this cuts both ways, and people are claiming victory on both sides, but
this country has done this before on race. And we've seen other countries and other leaders do it as it relates to religion. And unfortunately, the LGBT community is now the center of attention as it relates. Myself, I'm a volunteer with the foundation. It doesn't matter who you are, who you love, etc. As a business owner, my doors are open. As Chris has told me many times, there's 3 things about being in business: be open, have something to sell, and don't make it hard for people to spend money. If you can do those things in life and in a business, it's an amazing thing.
One of the other angles brought up was that this commission had ruled against some other business that had made cakes with anti-same-sex marriage messages, and they said, yeah, you can't do that. So there was some. It's not hard law makes bad cases, right? So maybe this is not the one to be really focused on, but people are finding it. Do you really think it's a defeat? This decision? I
don't think it's a defeat. I think it's the beginning of a conversation. This is the first time the Supreme Court has heard it.
Right.
I think hearts and minds continue to change each and every day. If you look at where the acceptance of the LGBT community is today versus even 5 or 10 years ago, we've had marriage equality here for 3 years in the state. And if you look at the level of we continue to move forward. I can tell you that areas not too far north from here, where we have Representative Daryl Metcalf saying things that aren't necessarily treating people with dignity and respect as it relates to the LGBT community, we have a lot of work to do. You have epicenters like Pittsburgh or Philadelphia or maybe even Erie that the community is being treated well. But outside of those areas, we have a lot of work to do.
So is that what Pride Week is about? Is it about continuing the push for justice? Is it a social event? In 2018, what is Pride Week? What's the message?
You know what, if you put 50 people in a room and you ask them what pride meant to them, you would get 50 different answers. There is not one answer to that question. For a lot of people, it's remembering the Stonewall riots of 1969 and the fact that there were folks that were just tired of being raided constantly by the police at the time, and the transgender people of color community specifically fought back and went into the streets. And we remember those folks. We remember folks who have passed away from AIDS in the 80s and the 90s, and those folks who are no longer with us anymore. There's lots of young folks who are just discovering their newfound sexuality, and they want to celebrate. It's soup to nuts.
I love the slogan, "We're here." Now, are people used to it? Is that really the goal? Get used to it so it's not such a big, what's the big deal? I'm a human being living on this planet.
Well, I think if you go back to Harvey Milk, he said, come out and be yourself. This year's theme is, this is me. And when people tell their stories, people's hearts and minds changed. You see that day in and day out. Nowadays, people don't know. Everybody knows a person that's a member of the LGBT community, whether it's a coworker, whether it's an aunt, an uncle, a brother, sister, whether it's just a friend that lives down the street. I think when people are open and honest and authentic about themselves and tell their story, people can relate. I think when people don't know a member of the LGBT community, I think they're truly ignorant in the sense that they don't know that person, and they're scared. And the truest definition of they're afraid of something they don't know.
What about members of the LGBTQ community in Pittsburgh who say the Delta Foundation, they don't represent me? There have been some offshoots, and now there's an alternate parade, right? There are alternate events. It's not just about what you guys are doing. Has there been a fracturing in the community, and is that necessarily a good or a bad thing?
I actually think it gives voice. If you look at a community, 10 years ago, there was only about 2,500 people that attended Pittsburgh Pride. Today, we have over 150,000 people that will attend this past weekend. I think if you look, when you give people voice, it continues to allow them to express how they feel. That's what Pride's being on, proud of who you are. We aren't the be-all, end-all to all things LGBT.
You don't purport to be.
We do not. We do not. We do our part. We're involved with a ton of different organizations. We do our part with our one staff member. But at the end of the day, it's about all trying to get to that same goal. There's a lot of people that want to push us back in the closet, that want to discriminate against us, etc. I think we all have the same common goal. I think how we get there is we have different charts and pathways to get there, but I think it's respecting each other and allowing people to express themselves. That's what Pride's all about.
Is Pride Week just a party, Chris? Somebody said it's become corporate. It's like the Macy's Thanksgiving parade now.
One of the things I always tell people is when you have 150,000 people all grouped in one place, that's a big social statement. That's a movement. That is advocacy. That is people who are downtown because they might not feel comfortable being at home with their parents, so they're down with their friends. It's people who might not be with the community on a regular basis, and this is their time to come down and celebrate. Like I said, it means something different to everybody. And I think one of the things that we're definitely seeing is more corporations, and Pittsburgh has been incredibly bracing of the LGBT community. But I want to make sure that it's clear that it's employee driven. It's really coming from the bottom to the top. These are not marketing people and HR people who are saying we want the company to be involved. These are assistant managers and administrative people who are saying we really want to march, and how do we get involved? And companies love to see their employees get involved and do things, and so they then want to support them.
You're preemptively answering the question which is coming next, that some say that partnering with corporations is a betrayal in some way of the mission.
You know what, we see it as a conversation. And you know, the easiest thing to do would be to slam the door in corporations and say, no, we're not going to talk to you. But we at the Delta Foundation believe that in order to change hearts and minds, you have to have a conversation. And you have to be at the table so that we can talk about the needs of the community, the healthcare issues that are important to the community, what the community is struggling with, and how those corporations can maybe help us get there.
All right, got to get a break in. Let's do that now. More of the KDPG Sunday edition in just a moment.